The Voidweaver Rises. The palace corridors had become a war zone. Cassian and Elena burst from the catacombs stairwell into chaos. Shadowspawn manifested in the hallways, writhing masses of darkness with too many limbs and eyes that burned with stolen light. Guards fought desperately with conventional wards that flickered and died against the creature's advance. The air tasted of ozone and corruption. This way! Elena pulled Cassian left as a Shadowspawn lunged from an alcove. Its claws raked the stone where they'd been standing, leaving gouges that smoked with residual void energy. Cassian's hand came up reflexively. Void flame danced between his fingers, effortless, eager. The corruption in his veins sang in recognition of its kin. He could burn the creature to ash with a thought. But not yet. Not until the Grand Hall. Every second of working time mattered. They ran. The palace trembled. Somewhere above, the conventional reinforcement working had collapsed completely, and now the Voidweaver's attention pressed against reality itself, like a vast hand testing the strength of a paper wall. Cassian felt it, a pressure behind his eyes, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Kale's memories stirred within him, recognizing the sensation. This is how it felt 300 years ago, Kale's knowledge whispered. This moment when the prison failed and the entity broke free. Another Shadowspawn materialized ahead, blocking their path. This one was larger, more coherent, almost humanoid in shape, but wrong in every detail. Its face shifted and reformed, cycling through expressions of rage, hunger, and something that might have been curiosity. A guard captain, Cassian recognized him vaguely from the palace rotations, stepped forward with his sword wreathed in blue conventional fire. "Stand back!" the captain struck. His blade passed through the Shadowspawn like smoke, and the creature's hand shot out faster than thought. It touched the captain's chest. The man's scream lasted 3 seconds before the corruption consumed him from within. His body collapsed into ash and shadow, leaving only his sword clattering on the marble floor. Cassian. Elena's voice was tight with horror. He knew what she was asking. Could he save the others? Could he stop to fight these creatures while the Voidweaver itself approached? The mathematics were cruel. Every second spent here was a second not spent at the convergence point. But if he let the Shadowspawn slaughter everyone between here and the Grand Hall, what was he saving? Kale's memories provided the answer, cold and practical. Everything. You're saving everything by reaching the convergence before the Voidweaver manifests fully. These deaths are already written. Cassian's hand trembled. The void flame wanted to be used. The corruption in his veins pulled toward the Shadowspawn like calling to like. "We keep moving," he said, and hated himself for it. Elena's fingers tightened on his arm. She understood. She always understood, even when understanding hurt. They skirted the Shadowspawn, using a servant's corridor while more screams echoed from the main halls. Cassian's core temperature had dropped to 71 degrees. His heart beat slowly, methodically, like a clock counting down to midnight. The dark veins had spread across his entire torso now, visible through his shirt as geometric patterns that pulsed with each breath. They emerged into the grand corridor leading to the hall. Here the devastation was worse. Bodies lay where the initial ward collapse had caught them. Magisters who'd been part of the conventional reinforcement, their robes still smoking from magical backlash. The ley lines were visible now even to normal sight, shimmering currents in the air that flowed toward the grand hall like rivers rushing toward a waterfall. And through the massive doors ahead, Cassian saw it. The grand hall had been transformed. Where 200 magisters had stood in formation, now only scattered survivors remained, staggering or kneeling or lying still. The geometric patterns on the floor, ancient ley line markers built into the palace foundation, blazed with sickly light. Above them, reality itself was tearing. The Voidweaver was coming through. It wasn't a creature in any conventional sense. It was a presence, a wrongness, a hole in the world where something vast and terrible pressed against the membrane between realms. The air above the convergence point rippled like heat shimmer, but cold radiated from it instead of warmth. Shadows gathered and swirled, forming shapes that hurt to perceive, geometries that shouldn't exist, angles that violated sanity. King Aldrich stood at the chamber's edge, supported by 2 guards. His face was ashen, aged a decade in the past hour. When he saw Cassian, something flickered in his eyes, recognition, dread, and perhaps a terrible understanding. Netherbane. The king's voice carried across the hall, despite its weakness. "What have you done to yourself?" Cassian stepped forward. Elena stayed close, her hand never leaving his arm, his anchor, his reminder. The corrupted veins on his face pulsed visibly now, and his eyes reflected no light at all, just endless black. "What was necessary, Your Majesty?" Around the hall's perimeter, surviving magisters stared. Cassian recognized some. Theron Greymark, leaning heavily against a pillar with his arm burned from magical backlash. Archmage Verena, her perfect posture finally broken, sitting on the steps with blood on her robes. Others he'd studied with, trained beside, whose names he was already forgetting as Kale's memories crowded his mind. They all saw what he'd become. They all understood what it meant. "The Inquisitor warned me," King Aldrich said. His voice held neither anger nor judgment, only exhaustion. "Mordain said you might be our only chance. I didn't want to believe him." The air pressure changed. The Voidweaver pushed harder against reality's barrier, and the tear widened. Through it, Cassian glimpsed something vast and patient and utterly alien. Consciousness older than the kingdom, power that made conventional magic look like candle flames before a furnace. And it recognized him. The Voidweaver's attention whispered directly into his mind. Not words, but concepts that his corrupted consciousness could parse. "You've made yourself like us. How delicious." Cassian's hand found Elena's. Her warmth felt distant now, filtered through layers of corruption and Kale's borrowed knowledge, but still real, still important. "I need you to leave," he told her quietly. "No." Her voice was absolute. "Elena, I watched you absorb a soul to get here. I documented every step of your corruption. I'm not leaving before I see how this ends." She squeezed his hand. "Besides, someone needs to remember. That was the deal." Kale's memories stirred again. Morgana stayed too. "My sister. She watched me burn. Perhaps it helped at the end knowing someone witnessed." The tear widened further. Shadowspawn poured through now, manifestations of the Voidweaver's power taking crude physical form. They spread across the hall, and the remaining guards formed a desperate perimeter around the survivors. Cassian looked at the convergence point, the exact spot where 73 mages had stood 3 centuries ago, where Kale had burned brightest and longest. The ley lines all flowed there, channeling the kingdom's magical essence in currents that the Voidweaver was already feeding on. 10 minutes. That's how long he could sustain Void Flame using Kale's multi-channel cycling technique. 10 minutes to accomplish what had taken 73 mages working in concert. The mathematics were still impossible, but mathematics didn't account for desperation, or for the knowledge burning in his mind from a mage who'd faced this before, or for the 69 other crystallized souls still waiting in the catacombs if he needed them. Cassian released Elena's hand and stepped toward the convergence point. "Wait." Archmage Verena's voice cut across the hall. She stood, swaying slightly, and descended the steps. When she reached Cassian, she studied his face with ancient eyes. "I've been researching forbidden magic for 40 years, Netherbane. Always academically, always at a distance." She touched his cheek gently, and her fingers came away cold from his skin. "I never thought I'd see someone walk this path willingly." "Did I have a choice?" "No." Her smile was sad. "But you made the choice anyway. That matters." She stepped back, and Cassian continued forward. Each step brought him closer to the convergence, closer to the tier in reality where the Voidweaver pressed through. The entity's attention focused on him completely now, and Cassian felt its amusement. "You think you can seal us again? You alone, carrying one dead mage's knowledge?" Cassian reached the convergence point. The ley lines swirled around him, visible currents of raw magical power. This close, the Voidweaver's presence was overwhelming. Vast beyond comprehension, patient beyond measure, corrupt beyond redemption, and hungry. Cassian raised his hands. Void flame erupted from his palms, black fire that cast shadows instead of light. The corruption in his veins blazed in response, and Kale's knowledge flooded through him. The patterns, the channels, the precise configuration of essence cycling that could sustain this for 10 precious minutes. But as the void flame built and the working began, Cassian felt something else. The 69 souls in the catacombs called to him, their crystallized essence resonating with his corruption. He'd taken Kale's knowledge. he could take theirs too. All of them. Become not just one mage with borrowed technique, but 73 mages unified in a single body. The power would be absolute. The cost would be total. Yes, the Voidweaver purred. Consume them. Become what we are. Join us. Elena's voice cut through the temptation. Cassian, remember who you are. He looked back at her. She stood at the hall's edge, her notebook clutched to her chest. The documentation of everything he'd been before the corruption. His anchor. His reminder. The void flame built higher. The working began, and Cassian Netherbane made his choice. He would face the Voidweaver with 10 minutes and Kale's knowledge. He would burn as brightly as he could for as long as he could. And if it wasn't enough, if the mathematics proved as impossible as they seemed, then at least he would fail as himself, not as a weapon forged from 73 stolen souls. The void flame roared. The Voidweaver pressed through. And in the Grand Hall of Thornhaven, the final confrontation began. But as Cassian's working intensified, as the multi-channel cycling technique pushed his corruption to its limits, he felt something unexpected. The chamber beneath them, the catacombs where he'd absorbed Kale's soul, responded. The ancient wards that had preserved 73 crystallized essences for 3 centuries awakened fully, and their power flowed upward through the palace foundation. The souls weren't calling to be consumed. They were offering to help. Kale's voice whispered in Cassian's mind, clearer than before. We didn't seal the Voidweaver alone. We became part of the working itself. Our essence, our sacrifice, woven into the fabric of the prison. That's why it held for 300 years. Cassian's eyes widened as understanding struck. The original sealing hadn't been 73 mages casting a spell. It had been 73 mages becoming the spell. Their crystallized souls forming the bars of a prison, their corrupted essence creating a barrier that resonated with the Voidweaver's own nature. He couldn't replicate their working alone, but he didn't have to. The souls were still there, still holding, still fighting. They just needed someone to channel their power. Someone corrupt enough to touch void magic, human enough to direct it, desperate enough to burn himself as the conduit between their sacrifice and the entity they'd imprisoned. Cassian looked at Elena one last time. She was crying now, but she nodded. She understood what he'd realized. He wasn't facing the Voidweaver alone. He never had been. Cassian's void flame exploded outward, connecting to the chamber below, to the 73 souls who'd waited 3 centuries for someone to complete what they'd begun. Their power flowed through him, not consuming him, but joining with him, 73 voices harmonizing with his own. And for the first time since the crisis began, the impossible mathematics started to balance. The Voidweaver's amusement turned to rage as it realized what was happening. The entity pushed harder against reality, trying to force its way through before the working could complete. Shadowspawn swarmed toward Cassian, trying to break his concentration. But the guards held. The surviving magisters raised what wards they could, and Elena's voice rang out clear and strong. You're not alone, Cassian. We're all here. All of us. The void flame roared higher, black fire that somehow held the promise of dawn.
Thanks for watching our stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic adventures.